Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second webinar in the Good to Great series. Last week we looked at the fundamental drivers of passenger satisfaction and how to manage these to maximize passenger satisfaction levels at your airport. And this morning we'll be looking at what are the main airport processes, seeing how these influence passenger satisfaction levels, and what you can do to optimize them to maximize the overall passenger experience at your airport. What makes airport processes so hard to manage is that they're not simply a question of performance. It's not just about how long or how short your waiting times at your airport processes are. It's also a question of what the passenger perception is of your processes. Take this picture from Oslo Airport. If I were to ask each and every one of you in this room how long you think the security queue was going to be here at Oslo, and whether or not you were satisfied with the experience at security, I would get very different answers depending on each and every one of you. Because when it comes to processes, it's not just a question of the performance, it's what your mental state of mind or frame of mind is coming into the airport process, what your overall experiences are and what your expectations are in terms of how long you think you will have to wait. All these will influence your perception of the airport's process. And so if you want to be able to improve and to maximize passenger satisfaction levels with key airport processes, it's also a question of understanding how different passengers perceive the process and what you can do to make sure to try to keep stress levels of all different passenger groups going through your airport as low as possible. Take again the picture from Oslo. A business traveler or a frequent traveler trying to minimize the amount of time he's spending at your airport will have a very different perception of the waiting time in this queue than a leisure passenger is traveling with friends going maybe to Ibiza on holiday. Even though the service is exactly the same, the perception of that service will be very different. And that's what we're looking at today. What you can do to optimize the passenger perception of the services that you provide in your key airport processes. For those of you who don't know me, my name is James Ingram, and the company I work for specializes in helping airports around the world find ways to maximize satisfaction levels. And we're not interested in helping you do that by building brand new terminals or new facilities, even though that will help you optimize service levels. No, what we're trying to do is we're interested in helping you understand how you can maximize satisfaction levels within your existing facilities, within your existing buildings, terminals, and with the constraints you have, and what you can do better or differently in order to be able to optimize and maximize the satisfaction levels of your passengers today. And that's also what this webinar is going to focus on. I'm going to try to give you examples of best practices so you can see what other airports around the world are doing and give you tips and recommendations so that you can start optimizing the passenger experience at your airport today without having to spend a lot of money, because there's a lot that can be done to maximize satisfaction levels at your airport without spending huge amounts of money if you know how to focus your efforts and where to focus. Today's is the second webinar in a series of 4 in our Good to Great series, focusing on helping airports get the knowledge and insight they need, or airport managers get the knowledge and insight they need to maximize satisfaction levels at their airport. Last week we looked at getting the basics right, so understanding which were the fundamental drivers of passenger satisfaction and what you can do to manage those as well as possible. And this week we'll be looking at airport processes in more detail, understanding how these influence the passenger experience and what you should be doing to optimize them or to minimize the negative impact, as will be seen, the negative impact these have on your overall passenger experience. Today's webinar will focus on answering 4 main questions that will help you better understand what are the best practices for managing airport processes. First of all, we'll be looking at how airport processes influence passenger satisfaction levels and how they influence the overall satisfaction with your airport. We'll be looking at how you can influence passenger perceptions of waiting times, how you can better manage your queuing to influence the amount of time passengers think that they're having to wait in your queues. We'll be looking at best practices for managing key airport processes, and we'll also be focusing on understanding airport wayfinding, which is also one of the key airport processes and one of the key sources of stress in airports. We'll be looking into more detail what are the best practices for managing wayfinding. But first of all, looking at how airport processes influence overall satisfaction levels. And for those of you who were here last week, you'll remember that we saw that in order to maximize satisfaction levels, airport operators and managers need to balance three main groups of airport services. If you want to be able to maximize passenger satisfaction levels, you cannot focus all of your efforts in the same way on different service items. So if you want to be able to maximize, you need to focus first and foremost on those areas which will have the strongest influence on overall satisfaction. And those are the drivers of passenger satisfaction: cleanliness, ambience, and the washrooms. And we looked into more detail at a couple of those drivers last week. Second level of importance are the airport processes: check-in, security, wayfinding. All the key airport processes come in as a second level of importance. That doesn't mean they're less important or less basic for airports. What that means is that airport processes influence passenger satisfaction levels and overall satisfaction in a different way. As will be seen today, what separates processes from the rest is that they will only influence passenger satisfaction negatively. So that means that you will only be, if your airport processes are poor, you will have a strong negative influence on overall satisfaction. But if you have the best processes in the world, these will not help you become the best airport in the world. And so first focus on the drivers. Second level of importance, make sure that your airport processes are performing well and that you're managing these well. Third main group of service items are the extras: shops, restaurants, Wi-Fi, all these things that you can do to differentiate your airport and make it seem special and more different to other airports around the world. And these come in as a third level of importance. You can have great shopping, but if your drivers are poorly managed, your queues are long, people will not be happy with your airport. To get the best impact out of your extra services, you need to make sure that your airport is managing the drivers and the key airport processes as well as possible. And so today what we'll be looking at is focusing in more detail at understanding these key airport processes and how they manage or how they influence the overall satisfaction levels of your passengers. And when you look at your global airport experience, so what passengers perceive of your airport and what they think of as their overall satisfaction, it basically built up of two main groups of factors. On the one hand, you have your processes, so your key airport processes, and on the other, you have your staff, the services you're providing, your architecture, the look and feel of your airport. And both of these groups of services or service items will contribute to creating a great or a poor passenger experience. And what makes them very different from each other is the way they do this. Whereas your staff, your services, your architecture, and the look and feel of your terminal can go a long way to making a great positive experience, but also, on the other hand, having a strong negative influence on overall satisfaction when it's poorly done. Whereas these factors work both ways, airport processes are very different. When processes are poorly managed, what happens is that creates a lot of stress. People will be very unhappy with the process, and if it's so bad, it might become the fact that the airport processes become the defining experience passengers have at your airport, and which will have a very negative influence on overall satisfaction levels. On the other hand, when your processes are well managed, the opposite of stress is simply no stress. And what that means is that when the processes are very well managed, people just don't notice them. And so your processes will not help you create a great passenger experience. However, when they're poorly managed, they will contribute to create a negative passenger experience at your airport. So in other words, when passengers are stuck in the queue, the only thing that they will remember about your airport will be that queue, and it will be a negative thing that they will remember about your airport. On the other hand, when there are no queues, passengers just won't notice it. So the best airports in the world, they make sure they have good airport processes, but that is not the thing that defines the passenger experience at the airport. This is not the best thing about the airport. What they do is that they make sure the queues are good enough to minimize the negative impact it will have on passenger overall satisfaction levels, but they're not wasting their efforts in an area which will not help them become the best airport overall. There are other ways to do that, and we'll be looking in more detail at the ways, the special things that you can do, which will help you achieve those top levels of satisfaction. On the other hand, the positive thing about having short queues is that when passengers are not stuck in a queue, they'll have more time on their hands. They'll be airside, they'll have low stress levels, and they'll be able to take advantage of all the different special services, the extra things your airports provide. And that's why processes come before shopping in our level of importance. If you have great shopping, but your processes are horrible and passengers are spending 40 minutes at security and 20 minutes at check-in, they will not be happy with your airport and they will not care about your shopping. So processes are important in order to shorten dwell times and to make sure that they're efficient enough that passengers have time to go into the commercial side of your airport to spend. But simply having great processes will not help your airport become one of the best in the world. To do that, you need to focus on doing little extra things, and we'll be looking at that in more detail next week. That said, what can you as an airport manager do in order to optimize the delivery of your processes? What can you do to make sure that your airport processes are efficient enough to guarantee that your airport experience is smooth and it's not having a negative impact on overall satisfaction levels? Well, when we work with airport managers, one of the common themes and common things that comes up is there's a strong belief that if you want to be able to improve satisfaction levels with the key airport processes, all you need to do is shorten the queues. Add more staff, add more security checkpoints, job done, everything is great. Well, it's not that simple. From our experience and from the research we've done, the way passengers perceive your airport process is actually much more complicated or more complex than that. The way passengers perceive waiting times in your queues will be influenced by a whole lot of other factors besides simply the performance. So yes, having short queues will help, but it will not guarantee that people will be happy with the overall satisfaction with waiting times at your airport. The atmosphere of the queue, the colors, whether or not the ceiling is low or not, the place that people are having to wait, that will also have an influence on the perception of waiting time at your airport. The profile of passengers, who they are, how they're traveling, are they alone or not? People alone might be bored more easily. Passengers traveling in a group may be talking to other people and won't notice the waiting time as much. Those are things that will also influence passenger perception of your waiting times. The amount of time people spend in the airport is also key. That's one of the key segmentations you can have between passenger groups, depending on how much time they have at the airport. People who only have a short amount of time at your airport are much likely to become stressed if the process is not going as quick as possible. Whereas people that have more time will be more relaxed and will have a bit more time and will not see the waiting time as such a problem. Finally, and that's also very important, the attitudes of your staff are also key. If your staff is seen as doing their best to make sure that the process is going as smooth as possible and that people are getting through as quickly as possible, that will help. If they're just talking to each other, sitting around not helping, that will also go a long way to creating a negative perception of passengers have of the process. So it's not just how quick the queue is, it's where you're delivering the service, so the atmosphere of the area. It's how the service is delivered, so your organization and your staff, and the frame of mind or the mental frame of mind passengers have coming into the process will also have an influence on how passengers perceive waiting times at your airport. And managing passenger perception of waiting times is understanding that there are actually 3 different types of waiting times that come into play when you look at the processes. First of all, there's what we call the perceived waiting time. So how long passengers think they waited at your airport. If you were to ask them right after security, how long did you wait? It's how long that they thought they had to wait. That's one thing. Second is expectation levels. Before coming to your airport, before going through the process, passengers have a clear expectation of what they think would be acceptable in terms of waiting time at your security or at check-in. This is based on their previous experience and on their profile, if you want. This will influence how long people would accept or not to wait in your key airport processes. And then finally, third is the actual waiting time, so how long people actually waited. And this will really be different. The perception of your queue will be very different depending on different passenger profiles. To illustrate that, this is a study we did last year for Geneva Airport, who was looking to try to understand how to optimize their security queues. And so we did a survey for them where we asked passengers after security to tell us what they thought or how much time they thought they had waited in security. What was interesting is that leisure passengers said that they thought they had waited 6 minutes and 50 seconds in security. So not that long. Business passengers, on the other hand, thought that they had waited 7 minutes and 51 seconds. Now keep in mind, these are people going through exactly the same queue with exactly the same level of service. Already, simply based on the passenger profile, there is a big difference in terms of how long people thought that they had to wait. Then we asked them how long they would accept to wait. Leisure passengers, luckily enough, said they would accept to wait 8 minutes. So they perceived that they waited less than they would have accepted. So this is positive. There's a positive gap there. Business passengers, on the other hand, would have accepted to wait 6 minutes and 24 seconds. So they thought they waited longer than they would have accepted, and so this has created a negative influence. So there's a negative gap there. And in fact, when we measured the actual waiting times people were having going through the security queue, it was only 5 minutes and 8 seconds. So what you see is that different passenger groups are perceiving exactly the same service in very different ways. And what creates positive or negative satisfaction is that gap that exists between the perceived waiting times and the acceptable waiting times. When what is accepted is longer than what you're perceiving, people will be happy. If, on the other hand, people are perceiving the waiting time as being longer than they would have accepted, they will be unhappy. And so that's what is the real difference. It's the gap that exists between perception levels and expectation levels. And perception is most important. If you want to be able to maximize satisfaction levels with your processes, you have to do your best to make sure that your passengers are perceiving the waiting time or the waiting in the queue is going as quickly and as efficiently as possible. And there are 4 main ways to do that. First, performance, obviously. The shorter the queue is, in reality, the shorter it will seem to passengers. So improving the performance of your queues will help. But it's not the only way you can go around improving your experience in the processes. Queue organization, so the layout of the queue, the visual impact it has on passengers will also go a long way to improving the perception of waiting times. Whether or not you're entertaining passengers are also important. Think Disneyland. People will accept to wait 1 hour before going on Space Mountain because in Disneyland they've done a very good job of making the waiting time as part of the service, as part of the attraction. There are things happening on, videos to watch. Staff is there to entertain you and to do things. So they can actually make what is a very long waiting time seem fairly short by entertaining passengers. And finally, courtesy. And that's one of the key findings that came out of our study at Geneva Airport, was just how important staff was for driving satisfaction levels with waiting time and security. When staff is seen as doing their most to make the queue move as quickly and as efficiently as possible, that goes a long way to creating a positive perception. If someone's had to wait 10 minutes, but then when they get up to the security machine, the guy is there and greets them with a smile and maybe a joke, they'll be very happy about that, and they'll give them the final experience they'll have at security will be a positive one. So your staff is also very important in terms of making the processes seem like they're going as quickly and as efficiently as possible. And now we'll look at a couple examples of best practices in each of these different areas. First of all, performance. Besides actually shortening the waiting times, informing passengers of queuing times can go a long way to creating appropriate levels of expectation. Whether you do that by having screens showing the waiting times people can expect right when they're in security, or for instance by broadcasting the information on your average waiting times on your website like Faro does in Portugal. Those are both ways that you're able to create expectations people will have in terms of how long they'll have to wait. The trick there is making sure that the expectation levels that you are setting are not too high compared to what you can meet. For instance, I was recently working with a European airport who measures satisfaction or who measures passenger waiting times in security by using Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. It's a good system. It helps them be able to broadcast the information live on screens at security, but also on their website, informing passengers before they come to the airport of how long they'll have to wait. The problem that airport was having is that the queues in security regularly went and extended all the way into the check-in area, and the system for measuring the waiting times was not capturing that. So you're informing passengers and telling them they're only going to have to wait maybe 5 to 8 minutes. They get to the airport thinking it's going to be fine. They walk into check-in and suddenly there's this monster queue that looks more like 20-25 minutes. Unsurprisingly, people were very, very unhappy with that airport security queue. And the funny thing is the airport managers were aware of that. They were actually doing manual counting during the same time and had come up with 20-25 minutes. But they didn't see it as being a problem of broadcasting information and telling people they would only have to wait 10 minutes. See the kind of negative influence or negative gap that you can create simply by informing people of waiting times that you can't keep? So information is key, but you really need to make sure that it's accurate and that you're not setting yourself up for standards that you can't meet. The layout and organization of your queue is also very important for influencing the perception of waiting times. Single queues like on the left might be more easy for an airport to manage. The problem they have is that it's the same thing as when you're in the supermarket. When you're waiting in a queue in the supermarket and there are other queues around you, you always feel like you're in the slowest queue and the people around you are going faster. What that does is that creates stress and frustration for passengers who come away thinking, I had to wait longer than I should have. And that's the advantage of the Disney queue on the right. They're seen as being much more fair. However, what they are negative is that for airports that you need a little bit more staff to manage these, because you're going to need people there at the front of the line sending people off to the right desks as quickly as possible in order to keep things going as smoothly as possible. When it comes to Disney queues, the big difference we've seen is really it comes down to how well that person is managing it. If people are there and are not doing a good job or just kind of talking, not really caring about sending people to the different desks, that will go a long way to make people unhappy. So staff definitely is very important for managing your queues well. If you want to create positive impression of your waiting times, the first impression people have is key. If the first thing people see when they walk into your security area or check-in area is a monster queue, no matter how short or long or fast that queue is actually going, if that first negative impression they're having is, this is going to be massive, it's going to be super long, you're going to have stress levels go through the roof and people will be very, very unhappy with the queuing, no matter how fast that queue actually goes. If people think they're going to have to wait long, that's the impression they're going to keep and people will be unhappy with it. So whether it's on the left, as in Keflavik, where they have way too many tensor lines in the check-in area, and people come in and think, whoa, that's going to be long. Or like in Denver Airport on the right, where security area is actually below and you look down on it, and so you can look down and see exactly how long that queue is going to be. These are both things that will create a strong negative first impression on passengers and will be damaging perception of your waiting times, and that negative impact will be hard to overcome no matter how fast your service is. Also on the left, I would argue that having so many tensor lines is not good at all because it breaks up the passenger flow, and it means that if people want to go around because they don't have to check in because they've done it online and they want to go straight to the security, they have to walk all the way around the check-in area. So you're forcing people to go a much further distance just by having all these queue organization things in the way that you probably don't need. So the way your queue looks, the first visual impression it gives passengers, is also key to influencing how long they think they had to wait at your airport. And finally, one of the things airports need to get better at is segmenting service. When it comes to waiting times, you need to understand that at your airport, you can basically break things down into those passengers who have time and are willing to wait a bit longer, and those passengers who don't have time and who are in a hurry. And so what you need to be doing is you need to be separating these people, getting the people who want to go as quickly as possible out of that queue and into a priority lane as efficiently as possible, so that those people who want to get in and out of the airport as quickly as possible are able to do so. So priority lanes and segmenting your security lanes or your check-in lanes according to different types of passengers is really key if you want to be able to optimize satisfaction levels with security. And it's not just getting the people who want to go fast out of the queue, it's also getting people out of the queue, those people who are likely to take up more time, whether it's infrequent travelers or families traveling with babies and who might have much more material to unpack at security, or people with disabilities. You also need to try to get those people out of your queues as much as possible into a separate line so that they feel they have a bit more time to go through security, and the other passengers don't feel like they're being held up by people who are maybe taking a bit more time than they would like. And a really good example of this is this picture I took in Madrid last year, and this is their their special line at security in their Terminal 4. What's interesting there is that they've created a special line for families and for passengers with reduced mobility, but people who have a mobile boarding pass are also allowed to go through that special line, because they've understood that frequent flyers are much more likely to have the technology and be used to having more mobile boarding passes and things like that. So they're able to go through a special queue. So it's not just a club or something like that. It's segmenting passengers based on their travel habits, which I think is a really good way of segmenting the service you're offering in security. And that's something airports should really consider doing, is trying to understand what different groups of passengers want from your queues and how you can segment your service to meet the needs of different passengers as efficiently as possible. So that was for queuing. Another of the key airport processes and one of the key ways you can create stress for passengers is wayfinding. Wayfinding is stressful because most passengers aren't going to be familiar with your airport, and quite often passengers aren't familiar with the airport processes. And so if you want to be able to minimize stress levels, you need to make sure that passengers are able to get through your airport and get to their gate as quickly and as efficiently as possible. And that comes through good wayfinding. If you want your wayfind to be efficient and to work as well as possible for you, you need to make sure that, first of all, it's as visible and simple to understand as possible. Passengers will only have a few seconds to scan your signs, so they need to be able to see them as quickly as possible and to understand the information you're providing as easily as possible. Also, your buildings and the layout of your terminals has to work for you. If your building is making it complicated because passengers don't have a line of sight where they can see where they need to go, that'll be confusing for them and they'll be stressed because of that. If your line of sight is great, as is the case in this picture of Hong Kong on the left, and people can automatically see where they need to walk, they'll be less stressed and will find your wayfinding simpler. In terms of information, it's also providing the information that passengers need when they need it. So don't provide too much information, but only provide the information that passengers want when they want it. And finally, it's making sure that there's nothing in your airport that is distracting passengers from seeing the signs or from reading them. And we'll be looking at best practices now in each of these different areas. If you want your signs to stand out, the first and most obvious thing that you need to do is to make sure the color code you're using is good enough to stand out from the background. A picture on the left that sign is absolutely unreadable because the airport chose a color code that matched its corporate colors instead of choosing a color code that was easy to read and stood out. Whereas on the right, Hong Kong Airport, their choice of colors and the way that the sign is designed stands out very well from the background and makes it super easy for passengers to see. So you have to make sure, first of all, that the color coding you're using has a good enough contrast for your signs to stand out. The layout of your signage is also very important. People will only have a few seconds to read your signs, so they need to be able to understand the information that's presented there as quickly as possible. And what works best in terms of layout of signage is a grid layout. What I mean by grid is having on the left, because most passengers will read from left to right usually, on the left having an arrow, then a couple pictograms, and then text or information with one primary message and one or two secondary messages, but nothing more than that. To illustrate that, look at these two signs here. It's exactly the same signage from the same airport, taken at two different times. The same information there. What makes the top sign more complicated to read is because it's not done on a very well-defined grid. You have arrows on both sides, you have pictograms on both sides, and text in the middle. The bottom sign is much more simple to read because the layout is much better, it's much clearer of what the information is there, and makes it easier for passengers to understand. So if you want your signs to be easy to understand, they have to be laid out in a way that makes them simple for passengers to read and to understand as quickly as possible. And your signs need to be big enough. If your signs are small, and this is especially the case if you're a large airport, that will be a nightmare for your wayfinding. There's nothing more stressful for passengers than having to go and walk from sign to sign as if you're doing an Easter egg hunt through your airport. The bigger your airport is, the bigger your signs need to be, and the more they need to stand out. Look at Singapore on the right-hand side. They don't need many signs. They only have one very massive sign in the check-in area saying shops and restaurants up here. One information, extremely easy to see, nobody can miss that. So when it comes to signage, think bigger rather than smaller signs. So if you have smaller signs, you're going to have to put more of them, and that's just going to make your wayfinding super complicated. Bigger signs are better because they can be seen from far away, and passengers will instantly know where they need to go. And your signage needs to focus on key messages. One of the major problems we have when we work with airports for improving wayfinding is that quite often we'll find that the signage has been decided not by one or two people, but you have multiple departments at the airport all trying to get their information on the signs. A commercial wants their information, individual shops would probably love to be on some of your signs, then you have the wayfinding, you have the process, and if you let everybody have their say and put something on that sign, it can become super complicated for your airport in terms of wayfinding. Again, look at Singapore on the left. What works about their signage is that it's super simple. They only provide the information passengers need when they need it. They limit the information on their signage only to the most relevant information for passengers. Kuala Lumpur Airport on the right, on the other hand, has made the mistake of providing too much information on their signage. This is a sign from the gate areas for passengers who are arriving, so telling people when they go when they arrive at the airport. Now, when you've just walked off the plane, you want to know how to get out of the terminal building. You don't want to know where the express train is, even though that might be a good source of revenue for the airport. So the mistake they've made here is having too much information on that sign. It would have been much better if there was one simple information saying way out this way. So in terms of signage, make sure that you keep the information relevant to the passengers when they need it, and limit it absolutely to the only information that is necessary for passengers when they're at that point in their journey. So show them information progressively when they go through the airport, instead of trying to show them absolutely everything about your airport on one sign. That just won't work. Another key mistake airports often make is labeling their wayfinding after airport processes, not after passenger goals. No passengers at your airport want to go through security. And this is especially true for non-frequent travelers who are unfamiliar with your airport processes. they won't know what process they have to go through to get to their flight. So labeling security checkpoint is not going to help these passengers find their way through the airport. What passengers want is to get on their plane. So you should label your wayfinding after passenger goals. A much better signage in this case would have been departures this way, or all departures this way. That's a passenger goal, and that's a much better use of that space than saying security checkpoint. So if you want your signage to work, you have to make the effort of putting yourself in your passengers' shoes and trying to understand what their goals are at different points of your airport and how your signage can go to provide them the information they need to reach that goal as quickly and as efficiently as possible. So think in terms of passenger goals, not airport processes. In terms of positioning of your signage, and this is especially true for FIDs, make sure that your signage is placed above head height so that all passengers can see it. When it's lower down, you'll see that you'll have big groups of passengers cluttering around your signs and will make it completely impossible for people at the back to see anything. So when it comes to placing signage, make sure that you put it high up where everybody can see it. In terms of signage, less is often better. Quite often we see that the more signs you have in your airport, the more that is a sign that your wayfinding just isn't working. If your wayfinding is so complicated that you're having to add in new signs constantly to fix it, that means that you have a basic problem with your signs that you should be fixing, and adding in new signs will not help you to do that. What happens when there are too many signs in an airport, it just makes the whole atmosphere seem cluttered. Remember what we discussed last week. Clutter is the enemy of a good airport experience. So by having too much signage in your airport, you're creating a very stressful environment with information coming to passengers from all different parts, and which will make your experience seem much more stressful. When it comes to wayfinding, less is usually better. Look at Hong Kong again on the right. Very few signs. Only information there is huge gate signs which can be seen from very far away and would tell the passengers the information they need. And they're not trying to have signs all over the place to provide information that passengers don't need. Fewer signs will make your airport environment seem less stressful and will make your wayfinding seem simpler. And finally, in terms of signage, another of the key errors we find airports doing is giving commercial the advantage over wayfinding. If your commercial and advertising is much bigger or stands out much more than your signage, that will be a problem, because that will be telling passengers that you care much more about commercial than about their experience or how simple you're making it for them to get to the airport. Look at this sign on the left. What do you see first? Well, you see the advertising. You do not see the signage at the bottom showing passengers how to get to the parking area at this airport. So similarly, in your different terminal buildings, if your advertising is huge, or if you have wayfinding stuck right in front of the advertising and not standing out at all because the advertising colors are much brighter and attracting the eye, that will be a problem. And what the best airports in the world do is that they make sure that they keep a good balance between commercial needs and the needs of their passengers in terms of the experience. And they will never sacrifice a good passenger experience simply for commercial needs. Look at this picture on the right is Incheon. And in most airports, these massive billboards in the terminal would have been given over to advertising. Incheon has not done that. They do have advertising on these signs, but most of the time the signage is showing, or the screens are showing, wayfinding information, showing passengers how to get to the gates. So they are giving prime real estate in their airport first and foremost to the wayfinding, but at the same time it rotates through to advertising, and so that sometimes you'll also be having commercial needs met as well. So if you want to be able to optimize passenger experience for wayfinding, it's about finding the right balance between commercial and the passenger experience. And if you're sacrificing the passenger experience for commercial, your wayfinding will never be great. So in conclusion, if you want to be able to optimize satisfaction levels at your airport, you need to make sure that your processes are not creating stress for your passengers. That means that you need to make sure that you're avoiding having poor queue organization that creates a strong negative first impression as soon as passengers see your queues. If the first thing a person sees at your airport is a monster queue, chances are they will be very unhappy and they'll have a strong negative impact or a very strong amount of stress, which will be hard for you to overcome. You need to avoid creating expectation levels that you can't meet. So make sure that when you communicate waiting times, these are accurate and that your airport can meet these. You need to avoid designing your airport wayfinding in terms of airport processes, and make sure you put yourself in your passengers' shoes and try to understand what their goals and provide the information they need to reach those goals. Finally, you need to avoid sacrificing wayfinding for any type of commercial, architectural, or any other interests which could go and negatively influence the passenger experience and the wayfinding experience at your airport. Best practices are, first of all, making sure that you set standards you can keep and communicating these to passengers. These will help you set expectation levels which are reasonable and minimize the negative gap between expectation and perception. Second, you need to make sure that you're segmenting your service according to passenger needs. According to the amount of time passengers have at your airport, different groups of passengers will have different needs. And so you need to understand what passengers want from your airport and what different groups of passengers expect from your airport, and go about in providing the service that they want. And the best way of doing that is doing surveys to understand exactly what passengers want and how long that they expect to wait at your airport. Thirdly, it's designing your signage and wayfinding for the occasional flyer. These are the people who will be having the most trouble finding their way through your airport. And so you need to make sure the information you're providing, the way you're doing it, meets their needs. Frequent flyers will know airports. Chances are they'll know your airport very well, and they'll be able to find their way around it without using your signage. So your wayfinding needs to be designed for the occasional flyer, the people who aren't familiar with airports and who usually have a harder time getting through them. And finally, when it comes to wayfinding, think fewer but better signage. Better information, better positioning, better layout. The fewer the signs you have, the better it usually is for your wayfinding. The more signage you're having to put in, the more complicated your wayfinding usually is, and that will usually be negative for your passenger experience. Similarly, if you're having to have ambassadors throughout all of your airport to help people, that usually means that your wayfinding is not working. So if you're having to have staff to help people out as much as possible, that usually means that your wayfinding is not doing what it should be doing. So those are the keys if you want to be able to minimize stress levels in your processes and maximize satisfaction levels at your airport. So I'm available for any questions you may have. Here's my email address and my phone number, and you're free to call me at any time if you'd like to discuss this in any more detail. If you want help setting service targets at your airport, or you want help understanding what passengers expect from your processes, we do have quite a few passenger surveys which can be implemented on very short notice, and which can help you better understand what passengers expect from your processes and from wayfinding. So if you're interested in taking that a little bit further, I'd be happy to discuss that with you at any time. And I'd like to invite you to join us again next week on the third webinar in the Good to Great series. Next week we'll be looking at how you can create a more customer-focused organization, and what are the things that you can do to make your airport special. What can you do to set yourself apart from your competition and to provide that extra airport experience which will help you gain that little extra 5% and maximize satisfaction levels at your airport. I hope you found the webinar useful and interesting, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again next week. Thank you very much for your time.